Okay, today we start a new maamar, Sukkah's maamar, which was said in the year Tafshin Mem 1980, the night of Yud Gimel Tishrei. So it means the 2 nights before Sukkahs, Yud Gimel Tishrei, in the year Tafshin Mem, which is the Hilula, the yard site of the Rebbe Marash, Yud Gimel Tishrei. So the Rebbe often would verbring the same maamar 2 nights before.
It often gets overlooked, this
well, it's a busy time, yeah. 13th of Tishrei, just between Yom Kippur and Sukkot. But the Rebbe indeed verbring said a maamar. Not only that, but this maamar was said on the night of Yud Gimel Tishrei and was published, put out on Erev Sukkot that year. So the next day. It doesn't say that it's muga, that it was edited by the Rebbe, and it doesn't look like it was edited by the Rebbe because it doesn't have notes and ha'aras like at the bottom that usually the Rebbe's maamarim did. But it could have been that it was looked over by the Rebbe, because it doesn't say it's not looked over. Usually when it's printed without being edited, it says bilti muga, not edited by the Rebbe. This one doesn't say not edited, so it looks like the Rebbe did look over this maamar, even though it doesn't have the copious notes that usually the Rebbe would add. Maybe because of the time constraint of when it came out. Okay. The pasuk says that for 7 days you should dwell in Sukkot. All the citizen, or every citizen of Israel, every citizen of Israel should dwell in Sukkot. That's the pasuk.
What's Ezra?
Citizen.
Citizen?
Yeah. Which, already that verse, just looking at it, seems a little bit superfluous. It's repetitive. The Sukkot Shivas Yom, you should dwell in Sukkot for 7 days. Every citizen in Israel should dwell in Sukkot. 2 phrases, just saying the same thing in slightly different ways. The first phrase says it has to be 7 days, but doesn't say who. The second phrase, it says it should be every citizen of Israel, but it doesn't say the 7 days bit. And the pasuk then continues. The reason for this: why do you have to sit in the sukkahs for 7 days, and every citizen in Israel has to sit in sukkahs? In order that they should know, all generations should know, that I placed the Jewish people in sukkahs when they left the land of Egypt, when I took them out of the land of Egypt. So 7 days sit in the sukkahs. Every citizen of Israel should sit in a sukkah. Why? Because in order that all generations should know that I placed the Bnei Israel in sukkahs when I took them out of Egypt, says Hashem. Now, from the expression of the verse that it says, in order that all generations should know, that you should sit in the sukkah in order that. We learn from there that this knowledge, to know that we're sitting in the sukkah because Hashem put us in sukkahs when we left Egypt, this knowledge is not just the kavanah of the mitzvah, the inner intent of the mitzvah, it's a part of the fulfillment of the mitzvah itself. As is clear from the expression the Alter Rebbe uses in Shulchan Aruch, when describing the mitzvah of sukkahs, it says that when you sit in the sukkah, you have to have in mind that you are commemorating the fact that Hashem put us in the Ananah covered, the clouds of glory, like a sukkah, surrounded us with protection when we left Egypt. This is not just the inner intention of the mitzvah. It's not the deeper level of the mitzvah. It is a part of the mitzvah itself. Generally speaking, mitzvahs are divided into 2 separate things. There's the fulfillment of the mitzvah, and then there's the intent of the mitzvah. There's doing the mitzvah, and then there's the meaning, the thought, the intention, the significance of the mitzvah. And they're divided halachically into 2 different things. There's 2 separate areas. There's doing the mitzvah, and then there's the intention. If you did the mitzvah without the intention, you still did the mitzvah. The intention is not the mitzvah, it's the explanation behind the mitzvah. So if somebody shook the lulav, but wasn't really aware of why they were doing it, which is sort of everybody, so then you still did the mitzvah. you haven't not fulfilled the mitzvah of lulav if you didn't have the intentions behind the lulav. And so too with most mitzvahs. There's the mitzvah, the doing, and then there's the intention behind it. There are two separate things. Sukkah is different. The mitzvah of Sukkah is different. The Torah itself says what the intention is. It's not written somewhere else in some sefer what the intention is. The Torah itself says, sit in the Sukkahs in order that all generations should know that I placed the Jewish people in Sukkahs. Which means that a part of the mitzvah, part of the doing of the mitzvah is the intention, is the commemoration, is knowing what it symbolizes. So if you sit in the Sukkah without consciously thinking that this is because Hashem surrounded us with the clouds of glory when we went in the desert, you didn't do the mitzvah. Like it's a integral part of the mitzvah to have that in mind. And that's learnt out from the phrase in the pasuk. It says, sit in Sukkahs in order that all generations should know that I put you in Sukkahs when you left Egypt. So unlike other mitzvahs where the intention is not explicit in the Torah, here it is. There are only certain mitzvahs that are like that. Very few. Where the Torah itself expresses what the meaning is, which makes it a part of the mitzvah. So that's interesting. That this mitzvah is different to other mitzvahs. You have to actually have that in mind. If you don't have that awareness, you haven't done the mitzvah. That's interesting. Why this of all mitzvahs? Why this one? Doesn't say that about matzah. You eat matzah, not knowing why you eat matzah. That's okay. A part of the seder is you have to talk about what the matzah is. But as far as eating matzah, the mitzvah of eating matzah, the mitzvah is to eat matzah. The idea is to commemorate that we left Egypt in haste. But if you didn't think of that when you ate the matzah, not necessarily did you not do the mitzvah. You ate matzah. That's the mitzvah. The intention you didn't have. Okay, it lacks, but it's still a mitzvah. Sukkahs, if you didn't think about why we're sitting in the sukkah, you didn't do the mitzvah. Because the Torah itself defines the mitzvah as to be aware of its meaning. That Hashem put us in sukkahs when we left. Interesting. Why is this mitzvah so different?
Sukkah or sukkahs? Because if you're saying it's covered, isn't that one sukkah? Or were there actually individual, which is what I often teach?
The Ananeh covered was one big cover for everyone. That's what I understood.
And we had individual
little clouds.
Individual tents or individual.
Well, there's a discussion. There are different opinions whether the sukkah here means huts literally or the Ananeh covered. Rashi says it's Ananeh covered. Maybe it means during the course of the journey in the desert there were several canopies that they were covered with. So it's in plural. So fifth line. It's well known the questions that are asked by the Rebbe in their maamarim on this concept. Why is this awareness so important that it's a part of the mitzvah, an integral part of the mitzvah, without which you have not fulfilled the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah? Why specifically here do you have to have an awareness of the meaning behind sitting in the sukkah, that it's commemorating Hashem's protection of us in the desert? Why is that more than any other mitzvah that you need to have that as a part of the mitzvah? You haven't done the mitzvah if you didn't do that. Why? Why here more than other mitzvahs? That's the first question. Furthermore, in this pasuk we quoted, what does it mean b'sukkos teishvu, that you should dwell in sukkahs? This question now is less technical and a bit more spiritual. The concept of a sukkah is that it is a surrounding envelopment. Sukkah is something that you sit in, but it is not in you. You are in it. You're surrounded by it. It is beyond you. It is above you. It's what's called a makif. Vinyan is yashvus, but when it says you should sit in the sukkah, that means hisyashvus. Hisyashvus means to absorb, to internalize, to settle. The teishvu kol gam apirish hisyashvus. The word teishvu really means to sit, but the verb teishvu is the same. It's the same shorish. It's the same root as to settle in. You have to settle in the sukkah. But that, shayach b'chinas pnimi dafka, settling is only shayach, only is relevant to something that's absorbed inwardly, not something that surrounds you outwardly. So here, the Rebbe is showing a bit of a contradictory nature of this mitzvah. That to sit in a sukkah means to be surrounded by something. When you're in a sukkah, the sukkah, whatever it is, whatever it symbolizes, whatever its power is something that's outside of you. You're in it. You're surrounded by it. To be surrounded by something means that you are enveloped in it, but not that it is enveloped by you. It surrounds you. You're not. You're in it. Whereas his yashvus, to settle, to dwell on it, to allow it to sit, means that it is sunk in. The experience has to be bis yashvus, which seems contradictory. If the mitzvah would be to bask in the sukkah, that would make sense. That the sukkah is this holy atmosphere, and you have to bask in that atmosphere. Just be in it and let yourself go in it. That makes sense. But the mitzvah is teishvul, that you should sit in the sukkah. The expression used is sit, or dwell, or settle in the sukkah, which that word itself denotes a sense of absorbing the sukkah. It should be internalized by you, which you can't really do with a sukkah. A sukkah is a surrounding energy, not an internal energy. It's something that you can bask in, you can lose yourself in it, but to have it sink into you, it's a different energy, it's a different thing. You know, there's two very different types of experiences. There are experiences that you have that you get lost in the experience. It's an overwhelming experience, something that inspires you, wipes you away. That is a very unsettled experience. It's like you're lost in it. You're not settled in it. Settling in something means something that you internalize calmly, you assimilate into your mind. It sinks in, and there you're much more in control. You're calling the shots. You're with the program. In spirituality, these are two very different types of things. Some things overwhelm you, some things you grasp and internalize. Some things are called makif, a makif experience, which means you're surrounded by it. And that is exciting and inspiring and uplifting. And then there are some things that are called pnimi experiences, which means something you internalize. It's not so exciting, not so dramatic, but it changes you in a deeper way. Like in learning, for example, that you can learn things in a makif way or in a pnimi way. What's the difference? A makif way of learning is you hear ideas, they sort of roll around your head. You don't really fully understand necessarily, but there's something there. There's some feeling of inspiration, of transcendence. Like you don't know what exactly it was about, but it was uplifting. Or sometimes you go to a speech, and the style of the speech is it's very dramatic, it's very exciting, it's very entertaining, and you go out feeling a buzz. It wasn't so much about learning something. It's not that you learned something new, you just got moved by it, inspired by it, motivated. That's a makif experience. That's one where you got lost in the experience. You're surrounded by this energy. What did you get out of it? Nothing very exact you got out of it. Nothing very tangible or definable. It's more of a feeling you got out of it, an aura, an energy, a sense of something. That's one type of learning, one type of lecture, one type of class you can go to. That's a makif experience. Pnimi experience is where it took a bit more hard work. You couldn't just sit back and be taken by the flow of the energy. You had to actually listen and think and process and internalize the message. You learned something quite specific, quite detailed. It is not nearly as exciting or overwhelming, but you took in another idea. Something actually sunk into your mind. You've learned something. You got a new concept, a new perspective, a new understanding. That's a pnimi experience.
So, like, would you be able to, like, repeat over that? Like, sometimes you walk away and you can't really repeat what you heard. But
Right, if you can't repeat what you heard, you can just say it was great, it was amazing. That's a makif experience. It put you in a mood, but it didn't give you information that you could actually share. And therefore it'll be shorter lived. You can ride the wave of that inspiration for a certain amount of time, but then you'll need another makif experience to get going again because it dissipates. Whereas a pnimi experience is you can actually say over, this is what we learned. And you can explain it. It's become yours. It's not somebody else's idea anymore. It's your idea. You've internalized that it's your thing now. So it's more longer lasting, but less dramatic. It's probably not going to turn you upside down and change your life overnight, a pnimi experience. But long term, you have become a different person because you've assimilated a new idea. You've broadened your understanding. So to have a makif experience, you just need to be there. Just show up. Just let yourself go with the flow. To have a pnimi experience, you have to focus and you have to open your mind and be calm and let it sink in. It takes more work. So at first glance, the mitzvah of sitting in a sukkah is a makif experience. The word sukkah means a shade, which is like a makif, something that surrounds you, that envelops you. You're enveloped by the sukkah. And so it would seem the mitzvah of sukkah is to experience a makif, to be surrounded by a holy light, to be enveloped by it. And yet, the wording of the pasuk that expresses this mitzvah is sukkah's teishvu. You should sit, dwell, settle in the sukkah, which seems to indicate that the sukkah experience has to be something that you internalize b'pnimius. How do you do that? How do you take a makif experience and make it pnimi? It's two very different disciplines, having a makif or having a pnimi experience. How can you do both? What's the idea of doing both?
It's almost as though when we go into the sukkah, we treat it like a home, a bayit, rather than just a temporary dwelling. That's sort of the feeling of it, rather than just
Right.
camping out.
But on the other hand, the very definition of the sukkah is that it has to be a temporary dwelling. It's built in a way that's temporary, but you have to live in it.
But you
Which
can
is again.
do that temporarily.
Hmm?
But you can do it. I mean, you know it's only for a week, but for a week it's fun.
Okay, but for that week, it's not temporary. So you're not living it in a way that this is my temporary home. You're settling in it. You're dwelling in it. But it is a temporary thing, which is still a bit of a dichotomy. Like there's a somewhat contradictory thing here that it's a temporary dwelling, like a makif, which is a short-lived experience. But you have to dwell in it. You have to make it like this is where you live. So really, generally speaking, to dwell, to settle, to internalize is a pnimi experience. But nevertheless, the fact that Torah says in sukkahs you have to dwell, it means that even after you've internalized it, it's still a makif. What are you dwelling in? In a sukkah. It's not that you're making the sukkah into something that it's not. It's remaining a sukkah, a makif thing, but you have to internalize a makif. Meaning that the internalization has to be the makif you are internalizing. That which is an envelopment, you have to make it into an internal light, which is a new idea. Like how does that happen? The sukkah it's emphasizing that it's the sukkahs that you have to dwell in. As it is a makif, you have to internalize it. That a light that is a surrounding light, you have to make it into an inner light. That needs to be explained. How do you do that? Gam tzarech lahavin. Beginning of the line there, halfway down the page. Gam tzarech lahavin. Mashakasav kol ezech Yisrael yeshu b'sukkos. The pasuk then continues. Every citizen of Israel should dwell in sukkahs. The first part of the pasuk that says, sit in the sukkah for 7 days, was addressed to who? The entire Jewish people. There was no exception. What's added by then saying every citizen of Israel should live in sukkahs? That's what the pasuk said. It didn't start off saying, okay, some people have to live in sukkahs, and you know what? Everyone should. It said, dwell in sukkahs for 7 days, talking to everybody, and then it says, Kol Ezek Yisrael, every citizen of Israel should live in sukkahs. Okay, we said that already. And in the original phrase, when it says that you should dwell in sukkahs, it says for 7 days. And then when it says, addressing to the entire Jewish people, every citizen of Israel should live in sukkahs, it just ends there. It doesn't say how long. 7 days. It doesn't mention it. It just seems cumbersome, extra, unnecessary. So now, from this pasuk that we just quoted, the end of the pasuk that says every individual citizen of Israel should dwell in sukkahs. From this pasuk Lamedim, we learn a law that's said in the Gemara in Sukkah. The entire Jewish people would be able to dwell in one sukkah. The Gemara there is talking about the size of a sukkah, and it says that the sukkah, even though its height has limits, but how big a sukkah is, if you had a sukkah to fit the entire Jewish people, that would be fine. That would be kosher. Why? Because ru'yim, kol Yisrael yeshem sukkah achas. It's appropriate, it would be fitting for the entire Jewish people to sit in one sukkah. How do you know that? Because it says, kol ezech Yisrael yeshem sukkahs. The entire Jewish people, every citizen of Israel should live in a sukkah. Hinting at that you could have one sukkah for everybody.
It says besukkos.
True. But it also says that about the sukkahs that Hashem put us under, which was the Anana covered, which was one big thing. So, some words work in plural even if it's one thing. Hang on a minute. We need to understand. The idea of unity, of the entire Jewish people being one, sitting together. Like it says in the parasha before Rosh Hashanah, that you stand, all of you, together as one. That's relevant at all times. The idea of the unity of the Jewish people, we should all be one, we should all be together, we should all sit together, that is relevant at all times. Unity. Oneness. To the point where the mitzvah of loving our fellow Jew. The reason behind the mitzvah of loving every fellow Jew is because we are all one. We all have one Father in heaven. We all come from the same source, which is Inyan Achdus. K'mvur Tanya has explained in Tanya Perek Lamed Beis. So, Ahavas Yisrael, which is based on the idea that we're all one, we all come from the same source. He called that Torah Kula, V'idach Perushahu, is the basis of the entire Torah. The rest of the Torah is just a commentary to lead to Ahavas Yisrael, the unity and oneness of the Jewish people. Meaning, every mitzvah is like an interpretation, a detail, an explanation, an extension of oneness of the Jewish people. That was the teaching that Hillel taught the one who wanted to convert to Judaism, al regel achas, on one foot. He said, what's hateful you don't do to others, that's the entire Torah, the rest is commentary. Go and learn the commentary. What does that mean? It means that every mitzvah is a means, is a detail, is an expression of loving our fellow. And the whole Torah is based on loving our fellow. How indeed is that so? How's every mitzvah an interpretation or a commentary on loving our fellow? How's shaking lulav, for example, or sitting in a sukkah, how's that an interpretation of loving your fellow? Because every mitzvah is to try and emphasize the soul over the body, taking physical objects and bringing spiritual meaning to that. And so every time you emphasize soul over body, you're connecting with the inner reality as opposed to the superficial reality. And that is how to come to love a fellow. Because how do we love our fellow? Because our souls are all one. Our disunity is based on external factors. Externally, on a bodily level, we are separate. On a soul level, we're one. Every mitzvah is to sensitize you more to the soul, see beyond the body, and that makes you more able to love your fellow as yourself. So when Hillel said that it's all about loving your fellow as yourself, everything else is just a commentary on that. It means every single mitzvah is a means to sensitize you more to the soul and allow you to love your fellow more, to be one with the Jewish people. So if Ahavas Yisrael is the basis of the entire Torah, is what it's all about, and everything else is just a means, an explanation, a method to get to that. So why is it specifically about the Sukkah, it says, that we could all sit in one Sukkah, we should all be united? Every mitzvah should be that way. The Pasuk goes out of its way to tell you that really the entire Jewish people should sit in one Sukkah all together, because we're really one. That's true. But that's not just true about Sukkah. Why doesn't it say that the entire Jewish people should share one matzah? We don't find such a statement in the Torah.
We don't find such an oven.
Yeah. But we don't also find such a Sukkah.
But it could be done.
So it could be that you could do a matzah as well. The matzah is baked in the sun. You don't need an oven. So as impractical as a Sukkah to fit the entire Jewish people is, but in theory, the Torah says we should all be able to sit in one Sukkah because we're all one. A united people. Can I say the same about matzah? We should all shake one lulav. Could have said that. The entire Jewish people should share one lulav. No other mitzvah we find this emphasis that really we should all do it together as one. There's nothing like that. And yet by Sukkah specifically it says, Kol Ezech Yisrael, the entire Jewish people could sit in one Sukkah. That's what the basis of all Torah is, the oneness of the Jewish people. They could have said that about any mitzvah. Why this mitzvah particularly?
And why that word, Ezrach, or whatever it is?
Yeah.
Because the pasuk could have said Kol B'nai Yisrael.
Very good. Yes. So
So-
Bnei Yisrael could have said any word, and Ezrach is an unusual word.
Yeah.
Citizen. Why that particular word? So we'll see. The man is going to explain the inner meaning of that word. Comes from Zricha, which means to shine. We'll see. The Rebbe will completely turn around that word. So that's yet another question. And to add to that, on the fourth last line in the middle, we've got some more questions. We also have to understand what it says immediately before this pasuk about sitting in the sukkah. It says, "Ulekachtem lachem b'yom harishon, pri eitz hadar, kapos tamarim, va'anaf eitz avos, va'arvei nachal." You should take for yourself on the first day the fruit of a beautiful tree, kapos tamarim, the branch of a date palm, the anaf eitz avos, a leaf from the tree that is gathered together, va'arvei nachal, and willows of the brook. These four species you should take together. It's interesting how none of them are named clearly. None of them. Arvei Nachal is the only one that says like Aravis. It's called Arvei Nachal, but even then it's called Arvei Nachal, willows of a brook, and they don't have to be next to a brook. Like the halacha is, it doesn't have to be willows that grow next to a brook. It could be any willows. So none of them actually really clearly named. You need the Torah Shebal Peh to explain what these four things are, but that's what the Torah says. Now, Yidua, it's well known, the mitzvah zu yesh lo shaychus l'inyan sukkah. There's a direct connection between this mitzvah of taking the four species and the mitzvah of sukkah. They're not just two mitzvahs that happen to be on the same Yom Tov, but there's a direct connection between the mitzvah of sukkah and the mitzvah of the daled minim, the four species. Which is why it says in the Alter Rebbe Siddur that the mitzvah min ha-muchar, the best way to perform the mitzvah of shaking the four species is to do it in the sukkah. which the Rebbe explained as being a detail in the mitzvah of the lulav, not in the mitzvah of sukkah. The Arizal is the one who writes that the best way to do the mitzvah of shaking the lulav is in the sukkah. You can shake the lulav anywhere, it doesn't have to be in the sukkah, but the best way to do it is in the sukkah. So some have explained that's because during sukkahs you have a mitzvah to live in the sukkah, to do everything you do in the sukkah, to eat and to have business meetings and to socialize and hang out in the sukkah. You should do whatever you do normally in the house, do it in the sukkah. So people have said, so therefore you have a mitzvah of shaking the daled minim, the lulav, so do it in the sukkah. That's true. That is true. But the Rebbe points out that the Alter Rebbe says that it's a mitzvah min mufcher of the daled minim to do it in the sukkah. It's something about the lulav that it's best to do in the sukkah. It's not just the way to do the mitzvah of sukkah is to do everything including the shaking of the lulav. It's that the best way to do the mitzvah of lulav is in the sukkah. There's something about the lulav that connects it to the sukkah. That it is intrinsically a sukkah mitzvah. And so therefore, even though you can do it out of the sukkah, it's better to do the shaking of the lulav in the sukkah. Because there's something about the inner meaning of the lulav that is relevant to the sukkah that makes it better to do it there, which we'll explain. Bottom line, the zeg gamma shaykh is until it's daled min and lebchinas hadas, bedugmas leman yedid the sukkah. And it's known in Kabbalah, we know, that there's a specific connection between the shaking of the lulav and the concept of das, of knowledge. Similar to sukkahs, that the sukkah, we said, is leman yedu. You have to sit in a sukkah in order that you should know, all generations should know that I put you in the sukkahs when you left Egypt. There's something about das, about knowledge, that is specific to sukkah. You have to know, you have to be aware, there's an awareness there, aware why you're in the sukkah. So too with the lulav, it says in Kabbalah that the lulav, the intention of the lulav is all to do with das, knowledge. Why? Top of the next page, as it says in the writings of the Arizal, when it talks about the Kabbalistic intentions of shaking the lulav. She'inyan kavanas hananuim the lulav hu lahamshich das lenuk v'dezah ha'omedes b'chazei dezah. It says in the writings of the Arizal that the kavana of the nanuim, of the shaking of the lulav, is that you need to draw down das, awareness, into the feminine aspect of zah, which sits at the chest of zah. Got it? Which is why when you shake the lulav, you have to bring it back to your chest. Whenever you shake the lulav in the 4 directions, in the 6 directions, after each shake you have to bring it back to your chest. So 3 times in each way and back to your chest. You don't just go You go Specifically, it says that you should bring it back to the place on your chest that you strike in Al-Khayt. That the tshuva that we're arousing on Yom Kippur with Al-Khayt, we're now doing it with love and simcha with the lulav. So you bring it back to the same place. But Al-Pi Kabbalah, why is it in that place? Because that place in the supernal body of the spheres represents the nukva of Zah, the feminine aspect of Zah, Malchus of Zah, whatever, and we're trying to bring Das into that. Putting it in just very simple terms, we're trying to draw Das into Malchus. Das is awareness, Malchus is action, and so we're trying to achieve through the lulav, according to the Arizal, that the lulav brings down awareness, Das, consciousness, mindfulness into our actions, which is Malchus, Nukva of Zah. And because in the supernal configuration of the spheres, Malchus of Zah is in the chest of Zah, for technical reasons, so we bring the lulav to the chest, because the lulav represents Das, that we're trying to draw down from all the directions into Malchus, awareness into action. This idea will become clearer as the moment continues, but for now, the Rebbe is pointing out that there's a connection between the sukkah and the lulav. Both of them are about awareness. Sitting in the sukkah, you have to be aware that Hashem put us in shelters when He took us out of Egypt. Laman Yedu, the pasuk itself says an integral part of the mitzvah is Das, awareness. And the lulav also. the mystical intention behind the lulav is drawing down awareness, das into malchus. Awareness into action. That our actions should be mindful, we should know what we're doing, we should have intention behind what we're doing. So there's a connection there. And this all needs to be explained. Why particularly here? We have many mitzvahs around, many mitzvahs we need to do, and usually in mitzvahs what's emphasized is the doing. The awareness, the kavanah, the intention, the mindfulness is good. It enhances the mitzvah, but it's not so central to the mitzvah. Whereas here, you didn't do the mitzvah of Sukkot, you didn't fulfill the mitzvah. If you sat on the first night of Sukkot, which is when the obligation is, the Torah obligation to sit in the Sukkah is the first night. The rest of Sukkot, if you eat, you should be in the Sukkah, but the obligation to eat in the Sukkah is the first night. If you sat on the first night of Sukkot and ate your challah, sitting in the Sukkah, and you're aware you're sitting in the Sukkah, you know you're doing a mitzvah, but you're not having in mind, we're sitting in the Sukkah to commemorate the protection that Hashem gave us when He took us out of Egypt. You didn't do the mitzvah, you have to eat another piece of challah. With that in mind. So how come here that's so central to the mitzvah? And here we find also with lulav. Lulav is also about das, bringing awareness into action. That we're not just doing things, we're doing things with an awareness. There's a connection there.
Is blowing the shofar also is part of the mitzvah awareness, or not really?
Mitzvah is to hear the sound of the shofar. The Shema Kol Shofar, you hear the sound. It's supposed to inspire with a sense of tshuva and all that, but like if you just heard the shofar, you heard it?
It's enough.
Okay. You've done the mitzvah.
Even though often people will read out reasons for blowing the shofar, like to remind us of Abraham.
Sure. Like every mitzvah, the reasons are important.
Right.
But they're secondary to the doing.
Okay.
In other words, if you heard the shofar and you went home and said, hang on a minute, what was that for? It's okay, you did the mitzvah, you don't have to hear the shofar again. Now you can start thinking, but with the sukkah, if you sat in it, ate in it, and didn't think what it's for, you didn't do the mitzvah, because the Torah itself defines the mitzvah as leman yedu, in order that you should know. So das, knowledge, is a very important, central part of the mitzvah. It's essential. It's not, if you didn't do it, you didn't do it. So, which you may have picked up that this das thing is also siyashvus. Being aware of something is also settled. It's a pneumistic experience. It's not just a makiftic experience. You're not just doing it and not knowing what you're doing. It's a pneumistic experience that you're actually internalizing something. You're being aware of something, which is the same as this teishvu. The mitzvah is about teishvu b'sukkos. There's some sense that you need to internalize that which is usually beyond internalization. That which is a makif has to become a pnimi. That's what the sukkah thing is about, which this is what we need to understand. And in base, we're going to start to understand what that means. Yeah? Ready to go on? We'll understand this by first analyzing what does it actually mean to take a makif, a surrounding enveloping energy, and to internalize it in a settled way, that you actually absorb it, which was besukos teishvu. You should sit, dwell, settle in the sukkah, which is a surrounding thing. But to understand this, how it applies to avodas Hashem, to our service of Hashem, as it is throughout our lifetime. We're now not talking about the specific mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah. We're talking about our general avodas Hashem, our relationship with Hashem at all times. There's also a concept of sitting in a sukkah, in avodas Hashem. Not particularly the yontiv, but any day, any time. To sit in the sukkah, meaning to internalize a makif. What is that? And in fact, on a daily basis, every single day, there is an avodah called teishvu b'sukkos. But b'sukkos teishvu, you should settle in the sukkah. Even though this avodah is mainly focused upon on sukkos, when it says b'sukkos teishvu, but there's an idea that the Torah is spoken in specifics and in generalities. Meaning that the Torah speaks in specifics and tells you a mitzvah that has to be done in a certain way on a certain day and that's it. But every mitzvah is also a generality, is a principle that can be applied at all times. This is something that, even though that quote, the Torah speaks in generalities and specifics, that's a quote from the Gemara, but Chassidus understands that as meaning every mitzvah you can learn it in two ways. You can learn it in its technical, literal sense, and that will be bound by time and space. So this is a mitzvah that applies at a certain place, certain time to certain people. Sitting in the sukkah is at a certain time, certain place, certain people. There's only obligation that applies in a limited way. That's one way. But the Torah is also speaking in generalities, meaning the fact that the Torah gives this mitzvah means that it is revealing a principle, a spiritual principle, and that is much broader in its application. It's not just for the festival of sukkahs, but all times. It's not just sitting in a little hut called a sukkah, but it's in an internal spiritual way. And it applies to everybody. So that's what it means that the Torah speaks in specifics, but also in generalities.
That is an example of it's like a law or whatever, but then it could also apply for everything, like when you learn it in the Hasidic interpretation.
Right, that itself. Yeah.
Yeah.
That there's what Pratos means, and then what it means in a Chassidus way. Yes. So Chassidus always takes a mitzvah and says, what is this in Avodas Hashem? What does Avodas Hashem mean? It's a phrase we use all the time. Isn't Avodas Hashem mitzvahs? No. There's mitzvahs and Avodas Hashem. There's actually two different things. Mitzvahs is the commandments that we do. Avodas Hashem is our relationship with Hashem, is our attitude, how the mitzvah impacts us, how it moves us, how it changes us. So there's the mitzvah of sitting in a sukkah, and then there's the avodas Hashem called sitting in a sukkah. The avodah of it. The mitzvah of it is a technical, specific act. The avodah of it is an internal attitude. It's work that we need to do inside of us. So v'yesh me'ein inyan zeh gam b'meshech chol hashana. So therefore, the mitzvah of Sukkot, which is specific to the 7 days of Sukkot, there is a similar parallel to it that applies throughout the year. But what is it? In a base in yonim the makif upnimi b'avodas Hashem b'chlal hem emunah v'asaga. Generally speaking, the two concepts of makif and pnimi, an enveloping energy or an internalized energy in avodah, correspond to emunah and asaga, faith and understanding. Makes sense. Emunah. What is emunah? Emunah is a makif. Emunah is not that I understand, not that I grasp, not that I've internalized, I've analyzed. Emunah is this all-encompassing sense of something bigger than me. That's what emunah is. Emunah is something you are in. You're in it. It's a state you're in. And so it's a makif. Emunah is not something that can be explained and described very accurately. It's not something that can be proven or tested. It's not something that you can convince somebody to have. You can't inject it in somebody. Emunah is something that is a surrounding light. It's an energy that's around you, and it can be ignited. You can help somebody ignite it, but it's not something that you can prove. You can't corner somebody into emunah. Like I've disproved all of your theories. I've proven all of my theories. So now you have to have emunah. It doesn't work that way. Emunah is something that it's more experiential. It's more. There needs to be an openness to it. You need to go into emunah. So it's called a makif because it is what's beyond hasaga, beyond grasp. Not lower than intellect, higher than intellect. Emunah is not switch off your mind to have emunah. Emunah is that your mind can only go so far. And when you have the humility to recognize that your mind can only go so far and there is something beyond your mind, then you can have emunah. So it's higher than hasaga, higher than intellect. It's beyond you. That's what makif means. But you're in it. Doesn't mean it's beyond you and therefore you're not connected to it. It's beyond you and therefore you're surrounded by it. You're enveloped by it. The fact that you don't understand it doesn't mean you don't relate to it. It means that it's not something you internalize, but it surrounds you and affects you from without, not from within. That's what emunah is. Whereas hasaga is understanding. Understanding means there are spiritual ideas that you grasp. There are things about Hashem that you can understand. There are soul realities, spiritual realities, that are not just relegated to emunah beyond my understanding. There are certain things that can be understood and internalized. There are things that we can grasp. So, like it says about Hashem, you don't just have to have emunah that Hashem exists. That Hashem exists is something you can understand. It can make a lot of sense. There's a lot of logic that Hashem exists. That He's all that exists. That nothing else exists. That you need emunah for. Opposite to what people usually say. People usually say, you have faith that God exists. No. That God exists, that's a fact. That you can understand. That makes total sense. That you exist, you have to have faith that you don't exist. Hashem is the only one who exists. You don't exist separately. That's what you need emunah for, because that you can't grasp. So hasaga is that which you can internalize inwardly, you can understand, you can grasp. Emunah is that which is beyond your grasp. You're surrounded by it, it's a makif, it's an enveloping energy, it's not one that's internalized. Emunah and hasaga is makif and pnimi. So the Rebbe says, you have to start off with makif, the makif of sukkah. And then you have to dwell in the sukkah. First you need a sukkah. You can't sit in the sukkah until you have a sukkah. First you need a sukkah, then you need to sit in the sukkah. Meaning, the first step in avodah is emunah. You can't really embark on avodah. You can't enter into a relationship with Hashem without emunah first. Emunah is a sense that there's something greater than me, bigger than me, that I don't grasp. Until you have that step of emunah, you can't start the relationship with Hashem. If you base it only on understanding, then your relationship is with yourself. It's not with Hashem. If it only has to be what makes sense to me, I accept. What doesn't make sense to me, I reject. So then you're stuck in you. There's nothing higher than you.
Do you mean Kabbalat Ol? Emunah is Kabbalat Ol?
It's a part of it. Kabbalat Ol is definitely a step of emunah, meaning that there's an acceptance that there's something greater than me, that is beyond my understanding, and I'm following that. That's how it has to start, with emunah. And how do we see this, that you start with emunah? The Rebbe says, this is just a fact. Every Jewish soul, as soon as that soul enters into the world, is born into the air of the world, has emunah. You start with emunah. As our sages say, that the Jewish people are believers, the children of believers. What does maminim b'nei maminim mean? It means that emunah is something we're born with. As soon as you're born, you're a child of a believer. You're a believer, the child of a believer. It's something from birth. It's innate. So emunah here is even before the Kabbalah's Earl, even before the active emunah, there's a background of emunah. There's a starting point of emunah that our soul has. That's what we begin with. Before we know anything and understand anything, our soul believes. We're born believers. The fact that we're called manim b'nei maminim is not just a nice saying. This is a true description that Torah itself, which is truth, uses to describe every Jew. If the Torah describes us as manim b'nei maminim, it's not just a nice compliment, it's a statement of fact, of reality. Torah is Torah's emes, and Torah describes us as believers. children of believers, which means at the moment we're born, belief is our natural state, is our default reality. But then, after a child reaches educational age, educatable age, where they can be taught, that they have awareness, then what started off as a relationship that was based only on a munah, a makif relationship, starts to become internalized, b'pnimius. Visyashvus. It starts to become settled in their mind, an understanding of Hashem, not just an amun in Hashem. To the point where it becomes yourself, your existence. Emunah, because it's a makif, it's not you, it's outside of you, you're in it, but it's not you. Becoming knowledgeable, understanding, hasaga is when it becomes you, it becomes your existence. It's not just something that surrounds you, it's something that enters into you and becomes you. And so that starts with education. As soon as a child is, you can educate them, you do. And whatever they're able to understand, we give them understanding of it. Because we want that emunah, the connection with Hashem, that's a makif, to be brought down to pnimius. But even when you start to understand, you still maintain emunah. Because after what used to be a makif is drawn down to be pnimi, meaning what used to be based on just emunah has now become understood, that draws down a higher makif. As you draw down the makif into your pnimi, what's also drawn down then is a higher makif that before was not even yet a makif. You didn't even know what was beyond you. That has become beyond you now, and that is your emunah. Meaning that the stage of the development of our mind changes from time to time, where something that until now we had on emunah was beyond us, we've started to understand and actually make sense to us. So that which a little child has to take on faith and emunah because it's beyond them, a few years later they start to understand those things. That doesn't take emunah. That actually I can use my hasaga, my understanding for that. That's become a pnimi. So have I run out of emunah? No, because now that I've understood that, there's a further level that is beyond my grasp, and that I have with emunah. And so on and so forth for the rest of your life. You're constantly expanding your hasaga, and therefore your emunah is being pushed to higher levels. And so what you took on emunah before, now you've understood that. So there's a higher level that you have emunah. As each level becomes pnimi, a new makif is drawn down. One that before was not even a makif because it was too far from you to even relate to as a makif. And that's for the rest of your life, how it goes. As you learn more, there's more things that are pnimi, and then the makif is on a higher level.
Yeah, so the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know.
Right, that's the paragraph ends with that saying. The point of knowledge is to know that we don't know. Just to end it with a story that illustrates this very clearly. The Rebbe once got a visit from the Belzer Rebbe from Yerushalayim, and their meeting was recorded. It's been written in the discussion that they had. And as usual, the Rebbe often, when he would meet leaders, Rosh Yeshivas or Rebbes or other people from other groups, he would often ask them about whether they learn Chassidus in their yeshivas, and advise them to. So Belz is a Chassidic group, and there are writings of the Belzer Rebbeim. And so the Rebbe asked the Belzer Rebbe if they learn Chassidus. So he said that they do, a little bit of Chassidus, but it's not like a part of the daily schedule. So the Rebbe said it should be. You should learn every day. Like you're Chassidim from the Baal Shem Tov, you should learn the teachings of Chassidus every day in the yeshiva. It should be taught systematically. So the Belzer Rebbe said that our way is emunah pshata, with simple emunah. That's our derech, is to have emunah. And if you learn Chassidus, what Chassidus is hasaga, is understanding elukus. So if you understand elukus, there'll be nothing left for emunah. And our way is emunah pshuta. So you can see he walked in right into that one, because the Rebbe said to him
Gotcha.
that Hashem is Ein Sof, is infinite. So no matter how much you've understood, there's infinite left for emunah pshuta. So don't be scared that through learning Chassidus you're going to run out of things to have emunah in. If Hashem is Ein Sof, so then it doesn't matter how much you've understood, there's infinite left for emunah. It's just your emunah pshuta is on a higher, more refined level. So, in other words, if your derech is emunah pshuta, simple emunah, that's beautiful. We're all into emunah pshuta. That's agreed on by everyone. But why settle for an emunah pshuta on that level when you could have emunah pshuta on a higher level? So by learning and grasping, expanding your hasaga, so then the emunah just goes to a higher level of makif. So that the Rebbe is going to continue to explain is first build the sukkah, which is emunah, then sit in the sukkah, which is to internalize it. It's a makif. Yeah, it was a makif based on where you were, but when you expand your vessel, your capability, that is no longer a makif, and the makif is pushed to a higher level.